Dober dan. Danes je naš gost svetovno znani ameriški ekonomist dr. Jeffrey Sachs. Je direktor Earth inštituta na Univerzi Columbia v New Yorku, pa tudi sodelavec generalnega sekretarja Združenih narodov. Danes se bomo pogovarjali predvsem o vojni v Ukrajini in njegovih pogledih na te tragično vojno. Hello, Dr. Sachs from Ljubljana. I was reading in Slovenian newspapers that you will shortly visit Maribor.
Yes, indeed. I'll be there later this week, so I'm excited.
Okay. But this will not be your first visit in Slovenia.
My first visit in Slovenia was 30 years ago.
30 years ago. You was involved in the economic reforms after we declared independence.
I was indeed involved with President Drnovšek at the beginning. He invited me to federal Yugoslavia, actually already back in 1989. And then I was involved in some of the early reforms, especially the introduction of the tolar and monetary reform. Yes, so this is now more than 30 years.
30 years ago. Okay, let's talk about war in Ukraine. What are your assessment? Who should be blamed for this very tragic war? Putin, NATO enlargement, who? Both?
Well, I think this is a tragedy in which you have a conflict of two superpowers, the United States and Russia. Of course, I think the United States made so many mistakes in foreign policy and basically over many years provoked a Russian reaction that was very, very hostile and very dangerous, but also foreseeable because US actions from the mid-1990s onward treated Russia as if it wasn't there. Basically, the whole theory of US foreign policy was Russia was no longer a superpower that needed to be dealt with. The United States was the unipolar power. It could do what it wants, whether it was bombing Belgrade in 1999 or invading Iraq in 2003 or recognizing Kosovo in 2008 or inviting Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO in 2008 or overthrowing Gaddafi in 2011 or trying to destabilize Assad in 2011 or contributing to the overthrow of Yanukovych in 2014 in Ukraine. These were all US foreign policies looked at from the Russian side as absolutely provocative and threatening. And in a context also where at the strategic nuclear level, the United States had abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002 unilaterally, expanded NATO repeatedly. And so Russia was absolutely convinced of American hostile intentions. And this is the root of this conflict.
But you said the other day that war didn't start a year ago, but 9 years ago, after the coup in Kiev.
Well, I think the coup was the opening shot of the war. And the overthrow of Yanukovych was the opening salvo. Now, exactly what happened, by the way, we don't know till this moment, because of course it's partly a covert operation of the United States, partly spontaneous, but absolutely with the US involvement in an insurrection and in an overthrow of the government. Well, that's pretty provocative. And that is the immediate root of the war, literally, because it was just very few weeks after that Russia retook Crimea, because under Yanukovych, Russia had an agreement with Ukraine for a long-term lease of Sevastopol, but with the new Russophobic nationalist government that the US helped to bring in February 2014, from Russia's point of view, this was a US maneuver that needed to be countered. So the war started with the overthrow, and it's been escalating since. And the logic when you have two major powers competing for influence is a logic of escalation. This is why it's extremely dangerous, because we have two superpowers, each one with 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons, and each one thinking, well, I'm not going to let the other one win. And that creates a situation of terrible threat for the whole world.
Putin put several red lines against NATO expansion toward the East Europe. What has happened in American politics that they did not respect his requests?
American foreign policy is arrogant, period. So this has been true for 2 centuries. Remember, 2 centuries ago, this year actually, the US issued the Monroe Doctrine, which said the US will decide basically the foreign policy of the Western Hemisphere, and Europe stays out. Already pretty arrogant for a new country at that stage. But US foreign policy is deeply arrogant, but it became more arrogant after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, because the US policymakers believed deeply that this was now a unipolar world. They believed deeply that the US now had a complete freedom of action and nobody would threaten the freedom of action. It was on that basis that the US went to war several times in the Middle East to topple Saddam Hussein, to topple Bashar al-Assad, to topple Muammar Gaddafi. These were US acts of regime change. They succeeded 2 out of the 3, but that's a kind of arrogance. And Russian red line was disparaged, neglected by the US, by the way, till today, because they think, in the end, we'll beat them. That's what they think. And this is extremely dangerous. This is the so-called neoconservative view, and the neoconservatives have been in power since 1992. Our lead neoconservative is Victoria Nuland. She's been part of every administration virtually for the last 20 years. Bush administration, Obama administration, Biden administration, and she's a key ideologue. And the fact that she's in both political parties shows that this is an ideology that transcends a political party. It's a dangerous ideology, but it's based on arrogance.
And who is then in the driving seat of American foreign policy? Neoconservatives or President Biden is a figurehead, or what's going on?
Well, he himself is a long-standing neoconservative in that he has favored NATO enlargement. He definitely was part of the engagement in the 2014 overthrow of Yanukovych, because even in the captured tape of Victoria Nuland, when she is captured on tape, probably by Russian intercept on February 6th, 2014, she's talking about her engagement with Biden, who was then vice president, and with Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan. Now, it's the same group. Each one has been promoted to one rank. Biden is president, and Jake Sullivan is not national security advisor to the vice president, but to the president. And Victoria Nuland is no longer assistant secretary of state. She's Undersecretary of State. So, but in the other party, there are also neoconservatives as well. The American people are, by and large, actually not neoconservative. They're just worried, pretty poorly informed, not really told much about what's going on, and I'd say rather divided about this war.
What is the main reason that American administration, Biden administration, is against the political solution of the Ukraine crisis? Maybe they try to weaken militarily Russia or what?
Well, I think the neoconservative view is that with enough time, the U.S. will prevail. What prevail means is unclear to me, because I don't exactly know what they think when the adversary has 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons. So I don't subscribe to their way of thinking, and I don't have a complete sense of their way of thinking, but they believe in the end the U.S. will weaken Russia in some sense, maybe leading to a regime change in Russia, maybe leading just to Russia declaring we've had enough, we'll go home. I don't know exactly what they have in mind because nothing is spelled out very clearly. But I think the general idea is this isn't very costly for the United States because the U.S. is big and rich. We could go on 40, 50, 60 billion dollars a year. Okay, Ukraine will lose a lot of lives, its cities will be destroyed, but in the end, Russia really will be weakened. I think that's their thinking. I can't be sure, but that's my interpretation.
Can Ukraine win the war against nuclear Russia? Is it possible to win the war against Russia? Is it this only a war between Ukraine and Russia, or is this becoming war between NATO and Russia?
I think that within a war of various red lines, there are some bright red lines, which is that if it happened on the battlefield, for whatever reason, that Ukraine was overrunning Crimea, I think that there is a very real possibility that Russia would resort to tactical nuclear weapons, in which case we would see disaster at a scale that is simply unimaginable now. And so I don't see what Zelensky calls his war aims at all feasible or rational, short of world destruction. Russia is not going to let Ukraine say it was armed to the teeth by NATO and say that it did have military success. Russia political leadership is not going to let that happen short of nuclear escalation. And to think otherwise is to gamble with the entire world in a completely perverse and reckless way. Of course, we can't be sure about anything, but we should be pretty worried. And given that what Zelensky says, therefore, in my opinion, makes no sense and is extremely dangerous, just to continue to cheer this also makes no sense. This is why all of this is so dangerous, because there's a lot of bombast and a lot of hate speech that if you add it up could completely spiral out of control. And we don't see responsible voices. I learned a long time ago that the job of the US president, the main job of the US president is to keep a foot on the brake, meaning to stop the escalation, because the US has a massive military industrial complex. It's like a powerful engine, always revving, always like a car that will leap forward if you take your foot off the brake. And a mature president keeps the foot on the brake. But we don't see that right now. We see a president that says, whatever Ukraine says, that's our policy. And what Ukraine says would get us probably into nuclear war if they succeeded in their aims. Now, there's another scenario, of course, which is that Russia will defeat Ukraine on the battlefield, and maybe the West will say, okay, let's stop at this point. This is another possibility. But if Ukraine actually were to succeed in its stated aims, the risks to global survival would rise enormously.
Yeah. Also, Europe will pay a heavy price for this war. You know, American President Biden, he announced the bombing of the Nord Stream in the presence of German Chancellor Scholz. He didn't dare to ask him any question or to make any kind of opposition. What do you think, what is going on in Europe, that our politicians are becoming American pure vassals?
I don't really understand the sad state of European politics, because European politicians have known better in the past. In 2008, when the US proposed NATO expansion to Ukraine, Germany and France were very clear. This is not right. Very clear. But more recently, European politicians basically do whatever the United States says. And the mood in Europe right now at the political level is without any scrutiny. Here you have, for example, the Nord Stream pipeline blown up. All of the circumstantial evidence, the statements by Biden, by Nuland, by Blinken, by Sikorsky, the former foreign minister of Poland, all of the reporting by Seymour Hersh point to the United States, and yet no mainstream European politician even touches it. And by the way, what makes it all the odder is that even the media don't touch it. The media used to see its job as questioning government. Now the media see the job as repeating whatever the governments say. Also, the odd part of Europe is that the diplomats have become the most militarist in the continent. So the foreign minister of Germany is the #1 militarist right now. And the special representative of the European Union only talks about war, not about negotiations. This is very disheartening, because at least the diplomats should say, we should try diplomacy, but they don't say that.
Mm-hmm. You know, I saw an interview with Chancellor Scholz on CNN yesterday, and Mr. Fred Zakaria didn't ask any question about the bombing of the Nord Stream. Just silence.
When Nord Stream was bombed, I said quite quickly that the likely culprit was the United States for various reasons. But one of them is that this was a very difficult operation to carry out. To blow up a pipeline roughly 70 meters under the sea surface that is encased in thick concrete of a very heavy steel, and to use a delayed detonation is something that only very few governments could even conceive of doing. So I said this immediately. I was brushed off of the American media. And then I met a lead reporter of the New York Times who said to me, yeah, of course it was the Americans. He didn't say that. He said, yeah, who else? That's what he said. And then I said, well, why doesn't your newspaper carry this? And he shrugged his shoulders. Then after Seymour Hersh's piece came out, I wrote to the managing editor of the New York Times actually several times, would you at least carry this story? You could debate it. You could quote the United States denying it, but would you mention it? The New York Times hasn't even mentioned it. This is phony. This is not news. This is just, I call it thumb sucking. This is not news. This is not at all responsible of the New York Times. And this is basically what the mainstream English language media are like right now. I can't vouch for the rest of the media, but no major media asks questions. This is true in London. It's definitely true in New York and Washington. What they do is they cover the US government position or the UK government position.
Do you believe then the Hurt insisted that it was United States who did it, this explosion, this sabotage?
Truly, when you know the details, you can think of 2 or 3 actors possibly. The US could have done it. Russia probably could have done it, but even for Russia to have done it would have been extremely hard because these are thoroughly monitored waters. These are NATO waters. Maybe, potentially, Sweden or Norway or Denmark could have done it, but never without the US participation. That's impossible. So what Seymour Hersh wrote makes a tremendous amount of sense. Nobody has denied any single material aspect of his writing. The US hasn't offered any alternative at all. It's as if it's unworthy to even ask. And I testified to the UN Security Council about this a couple of weeks ago, and the US ambassador wouldn't even allow the idea that the Security Council should look into this. He said the very idea that the Security Council should look into this is a Russian-led distraction from Russia's war crimes. Instead of saying, here is a major terrorist action on international infrastructure, of course we should look into it. They denied even the desire to look into it. And of course, frankly, listen to what Victoria Nuland said. She said that the US administration is delighted that Nord Stream 2 is now a hunk of twisted metal on the seabed. Could anyone talk like that if they were concerned about international terrorism against international infrastructure? Of course not. So something is seriously wrong when our media will not even discuss these issues.
Even Chancellor Scholz is afraid to ask publicly who did that sabotage. Do you think German government can survive this politically?
I'm pretty sure the German government knows exactly what happened. It would be interesting for the German government to report to the Bundestag and to the German people about what it thinks happened. We have democratic institutions that don't function. Democratic institutions report to the people. They explain to the people the issues. They discuss the issues. They have parliaments in which these issues can be debated. But this is not functioning. And there is no excuse for that because our lives depend on the functioning of our political institutions. So we need to address issues in which our lives are at stake. And what is extremely weird is that Sweden has gone down to the crime scene. It has investigated the crime scene, and yet supposedly it has not told Germany or Denmark or the Swedish people or the UN Security Council anything about what it's found.
You know, some analysts are saying that the real aim of this war in Ukraine is not only to weaken the Russia or to defeat it, but that the real aim is China. What do you think about that?
People say that seriously, even grown-ups, but it is unworthy of grown-ups. It's the height of irresponsibility, but it is part of the American discourse. It's as if we're playing a game. The game that I played as a child, a board game, was called the game of Risk, which is trying to put your piece on every part of the world map. It seems like they think they're playing a game, but they're playing with our lives. And so this talk that this isn't even about Ukraine, which is suffering hundreds of thousands of deaths of Ukrainians and Russians there. Oh, it's not about that. It's to scare China. The whole idea that people could say this and pretend to be grown-ups with grown-up mentality is terrifying, frankly.
You know, peace movement in the world, also in the United States and the Western Europe, is very weak. Why do you think, what's the source that people are not much more against this war, which could be fatal for all of us?
I think people don't understand. They're scared in general, demoralized. They don't really believe their governments, but they don't know what to believe. The facts are few. The media don't present opportunities to understand all of this. But the fact is, I don't really have an explanation for your question, which is an excellent question, because the risks are extremely high and the response so far is completely inadequate to the risks. We need a peace movement. And the fact that we can't, the fact that we are now more than a year into the war and Biden and Putin have not even talked once is mind-boggling to me, because it is their job to talk and to stop risking the survival of the world. That's their job. And yet we don't even have a public call for even trying diplomacy right now. And frankly, my country, I'm used to this because I've lived through so many misguided wars. Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Nicaragua, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. The United States has lots and lots of misguided wars. But where is Europe on this? Where the stakes are so high. Say something. People in Europe should say something that they demand at least trying diplomacy. And they don't.
But you know, a group of prominent Slovenian intellectuals published an appeal, stop the war in Ukraine, but you know, we were surprised that we were attacked, that we are trying to sell victim to the aggressor.
You know, it's important to keep pressing this point and this line that if you want negotiations, you're a Putin apologist, is, of course, nonsense and disgraceful. It's wanting a solution so that we don't have hundreds of thousands of more people dying and the whole world put at risk. It's very straightforward. And the idea that you can't call for peace other than being a Putin apologist is a phony charge. And we have to persevere, no matter what kind of attack is made, that this is absolutely a misunderstanding. The call for peace is so that the two superpowers back off and Ukraine can be alive. That's what this is about.
You are one of the most important forces in the United Nations system for sustainable development. What will be the effect of the Ukrainian war on the general economic development in the world, and especially in developing countries?
All of this is devastating for sustainable development. Both the direct effects of the war and the sanctions regime is very adverse. But of course, even more than that is the breakdown of international cooperation, which is essential for sustainable development. We cannot have climate safety unless there's global cooperation. We cannot end poverty unless there's global cooperation. And as long as this war goes on, it destroys all of the cooperative processes. Look at the G20 meetings right now. The United States and Europe make them only about Ukraine, whereas actually there is a whole world of problems to discuss. But they don't want to discuss that. They want to use the G20 for their propaganda, frankly speaking. This is not acceptable because the world has problems of poverty, of climate disaster, of ecosystems collapsing, of major groups that are in desperation, some forced into migration because of hunger or poverty, the continued effects of the pandemic. The G20 needs to address these sustainable development issues, not to be the forum for the West to attack Russia. And this is what is happening. Our instruments of cooperation are also completely being sidelined by this disaster.
And my last question, what will be the outcome of this war? Can we avoid a new Cold War?
We're in a new Cold War right now already. We're in a Cold War that involves the US on one side, China, Russia, and other countries on the other side. This is already a Cold War and in part a hot war. The question is, can we get out of this? And to get out of this, we need a change of US foreign policy from the attempt at hegemony, because there is no place for a world hegemon anymore. We don't need a world leader. We need global cooperation. But the neoconservative idea is the world only works if the United States is leading. This idea was never right, but it is a dangerous illusion and anachronism in the 21st century. Who wants US leadership? What we want is US cooperation. We need the US, Europe, Russia, China, India, Brazil, African Union, cooperating to solve problems. That's what we want in foreign policy. And this is really the great struggle. We are in a Cold War already. The problem is the Cold War's already gotten hot in Ukraine, and it could explode into outright conflict over Taiwan, because the same kind of dynamics are at play in Taiwan. The US is heavily arming Taiwan. The US is ignoring all of China's red lines, just like happened in Ukraine. The US is sending political leaders on military escorts to Taiwan to say how we will defend Taiwan. And it's very similar to the dynamics that led to the Ukraine war. And of course, promoted by the same foreign policy people. So this is a huge danger.
Can this be changed after the American elections?
Yes. It could be changed before the American elections. It could be changed after the American elections. It requires a change of heart, a change of basic idea. It requires the President of the United States saying, you know, this isn't working. This is extraordinarily dangerous. That's what it requires. It requires some honesty to the American people of how dangerous this is. It requires, by the way, if European leaders would say, enough, we actually don't want a nuclear war starting on our continent. If European leaders would be straightforward, Scholz, Macron, and others, it would also stop, because the US does this in part because all the European leaders say, yes, we support this 100%. If they stopped supporting it and started thinking about Europe's survival interests, and the fact, and this is the point, this is not saving Ukraine. It's not making Ukraine any safer, quite the contrary. It's not solving any problems, and there is no clear approach. What they are advocating doesn't even make sense. Ukraine defeating Russia. And this is plain as day. So they don't even have a plan. So this is where responsibility in Europe could make a difference. The US has its neocons. Europe had more sense most of the post-war period until very, very recently. And we're not hearing that sense. I don't expect too much of Britain. Britain has hated Russia for 2 centuries. The British media have been wildly Russophobic for 200 years. This for the UK is the Second Crimean War. They hated Russia in 1853 and the same kind of propaganda. But where is Spain? Where is Italy? Where is France? Where is Germany? And of course, many, many other countries, including Slovenia. Some sense, some common sense to back off and try to sit down and settle this thing. And by the way, settling it is not hard. That's the basic point. NATO has to say, we will not enlarge to Ukraine. Crimea will stay with Russia. There will be some solution, even the Minsk agreements, which should have been enforced in the Donbass, and Russia will go home and stop the fighting. And there is a basis for peace on that, where both sides go home and nobody wins over the other. That's what's needed right now. And that's what needs to be tried in diplomacy.
Sir, thank you very much, Professor, for your wise words about Ukraine and the future of our civilization. Thank you very much, and welcome in Slovenia next week.
Thank you so much. Great to talk with you.